Listen up, the time is now. Hear Lewayne spin tales of dragons, red herrings, legends, suspense, and love. It's story by story by story by.
Hi, welcome back to the Story By podcast. Thanks for stopping by. Today's episode is an early one, and like the story in episode 1, is inspired by actual events and people. But not really. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the show, if you want to stick around. Otherwise, let's take a trip back in time with Jeffrey Blake, as he learns about his past via ghost pictures. Jeffrey discovered the device during his first visit to his grandparents' house when he was 7 years old. Having lived his whole life at a New York flat, he considered their old farmhouse the coolest thing he'd ever seen. An afternoon of wandering through the house led him finally to the back room on the 3rd floor. This room, unlike the others, didn't have a closet. Instead, the door concealed stairs leading up to the attic. Jeffrey knew there was no way in hell he was going up there, so he contented himself with peeking into the boxes that lay stacked around the room, the ones bound for the attic that hadn't quite made it yet. He opened half a dozen different cardboard cartons, sneezing a few times after each. The dust began to hang in the air, and his vision gradually blurred. In fact, he nearly missed his treasure. After releasing a sneeze that he thought would bring the house crumbling down, he rubbed his nose and blinked. There, under a pile of objects that resembled postcards, lay the device. It looked like a strange set of binoculars, but a wooden post jutted out ahead of the eyepieces. Toward the end of the post lay a crossbar with 2 upright metal loops. As Jeffrey drew the antique contraption from the box, he discovered a handle that hung down from the eyepiece. Turning the contraption over and over in his hands, he fiddled with it until he realized that the handle folded against the eyepieces, and the crossbar could slide back and forth along the length of the post. Looking through the eye holes, he made out blurry double images of everything in the room. He pulled his eyes away and tried to determine what purpose this thing served. Then he saw the items he'd mistaken for postcards. The cards did have pictures, like the ones his parents sent him from all their trips, but these were 2 identical pictures placed side by side. Curious, he drew one from the pile and slid it into the wire frames attached to the crossbar. Immediately he discovered a black and white, or rather, brown and white, photo of Niagara Falls. Reflexively, he reached out to touch the water rushing down over the rocks. He practically heard the screams of the crowd gathered to watch a man go over the falls in a barrel. Amazing! This thing he held was something like his battered Viewmaster at home, but instead of Snoopy or the Super Friends, he saw real pictures. History stuff. Removing the Niagara Falls photo, he pulled out a picture entitled State Fair. Popping it before his eyes, he saw a 3-dimensional photo of the Iowa State Fair from the early part of the 20th century. He could almost smell the animals, the sweat, and the frying food. Grabbing another card, he saw the county courthouse, then the Des Moines skyline. Next came a view from Clark's Tower in Winterset. After that, he saw the Statue of Liberty. The next thing Jeffrey knew, Grandma Marion called him to supper. He glanced at his new digital watch and discovered that he'd spent 4 hours staring at faraway places in other times. Quickly, he tossed the cards back into the box, making sure to keep the ones he had seen separated from the ones he had yet to enjoy. Then, with near reverence, he placed the viewing device into the box, and stared at it longingly. Then Grandma called again, and he dashed from the room and flew down the stairs. At supper, he told his grandparents what he'd found. "That's called a stereoscope, Jeffy," replied Grandpa Howard. "We used it to look at pictures from all over." Grandma laughed. "Remember that one with the fellow on the unicycle, clowning around at the circus? He was the silliest thing." "I saw that one," Jeffrey piped up. "It said it was P.T. Barnum's show. Who's P.T. Barnum?" His grandparents told him about Barnum, and several of the other scenes on the cards. Jeffrey had viewed some, but now he was anxious to see it all. "Those were different days," Grandpa said. "May I go back up tonight and look some more?" "Maybe in the morning," Grandma replied. "Your mother'd throw a fit if we let you stay up too late." Jeffrey doubted that his mother or father would care one way or the other. They'd be too busy enjoying Maui, or Fiji, or wherever they'd flown off to this time. That night, Jeffrey contented himself with sitting on the porch swing, listening, as Grandma and Grandpa described the good old days. Some of the things they talked about, like one-room schools and cutting ice from frozen lakes, were stuff Jeffrey had only seen in movies. Grandma Marion told him about radio shows, milking cows, and collecting eggs from chickens. Grandpa Howard told him about musicians and singers that performed on the courthouse steps in town. People would gather with blankets and picnic baskets and spend hours listening to them. When Jeffrey raised a skeptical eyebrow, Howard added, "Sure, we can watch singers on Lawrence Welk on the TV, but it's not the same." "Why not?" Jeffrey asked. Grandpa Howard shrugged. "It's hard to explain, Jeffy. When you see people perform and you know there's no second takes or fancy editing, it seems more honest. You know there's no bull—" "Howard!" Grandma interrupted. "Patties," Grandpa finished and winked at Jeffrey. Jeffrey nodded, thinking he knew a lot of people who were full of bull patties. His parents, high on that list, were surrounded by them. Then he thought about their home in New York with the view of more of New York, the honking cabs, the doormen in their stupid uniforms, the kids at his school in their stupid uniforms. It was all bull patties. Jeffrey looked out at the gravel road and realized he hadn't seen a car pass by in hours. He smelled fresh mown grass and the distant scent of the cattle and hogs. In the distance, bugs made weird buzzing noises. As darkness approached, Jeffrey watched for the lightning bugs with blinking butts, and when it got dark, it was actually dark. No street lights, just the faint glow of the yard light in the distance to let you know there was another farm somewhere across the field. Jeffrey yawned and leaned against Grandpa Howard. His mind drifted back to the box with the magic cards, the doorway to the good old days. Jeffrey never got a chance to look at the stereoscope the next day. His parents returned early and unexpected. There had been some problems at his father's firm, and he had to come back to fix things. So they'd cut their trip short and arrived to pick him up on the way back to New York. Sadly, Jeffrey went with them, crushed that he'd missed the chance to view more of the magic cards. He sat in silence for the entire flight home, thinking about brown and white pictures. It would be 7 years before he returned to that small Iowa farm, and when he did, it would be for Grandpa Howard's funeral. Jeffrey was 14 when he next saw the stereoscope. Grandpa Howard had just been buried, and everyone had returned to the farm to console Grandma Marion. Basically, his parents would be drinking, and his grandparents' friends would be telling everyone what a great man Howard had been. Rather than suffer a crowd of people that he didn't know, his own parents included, Jeffrey crept up the creaking stairs to the last room on the 3rd floor. The box was still there. In fact, it looked like it had never been moved, even after 6 or 7 years. As Jeffrey looked inside, he could see that someone had been looking at the pictures since his departure as a child. He could see different piles than those he had left, and a tear slid away from his eyes. Jeffrey imagined Grandpa Howard peering into the good old days, smiling and laughing his bizarre belly laugh. He could almost see Grandpa sitting beside him, passing the antique stereoscope to Grandma, and laughing some more. Perhaps he would be looking at the clown on the unicycle, or the dancing Siamese twins, or the amazing Mr. Sear and his crystal ball. Maybe Grandpa was just enjoying his hometown the way it had looked when he was a child. Jeffrey raised the device to his eyes and stared into the past. With a small shriek, he dropped the stereoscope into the box as if it had bitten him. His hands shaking, Jeffrey reached into the cardboard carton and extracted the stereoscope again. Peering through the lenses, he stared at the card that held the town square in Winterset. A band in striped jackets performed on the steps of the courthouse, and a crowd had gathered to watch. The men wore straw hats, the women wore bonnets, and children sat on blankets beside wicker picnic baskets. Everyone sat frozen, applauding the musician's performance. Toward the edge of the crowd stood a tall, gangly man with his remaining hair parted sharply on the left. Grandpa Howard. Jeffrey pulled himself away, blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. His grandfather, just buried, stood frozen in time, watching a silly-looking ragtime band. "It can't be," Jeffrey muttered. "Maybe it's some old relative of Grandpa's, my great-grandpa or something." Rather than risk another look and prove himself wrong, Jeffrey lowered the stereoscope reverently back into the box. Then he went down to his waiting family and said nothing of Grandpa Howard. When Jeffrey was 26, he returned to the Iowa farm for the last time. Grandma Marion was gone now. Jeffrey hadn't attended her funeral because he'd been in court. finalizing the end of a bitter and vicious marriage. He did, however, attend the reading of Marion's will, where he learned that he was the executor of Howard and Marion's estate. As a result, he sat once again in the old farmhouse, sifting through the remnants of his grandparents' lives. After a few hours of sorting through the decades of paperwork that they had maintained, he gave up and took a break. Walking into the kitchen, he poured a cup of coffee and slumped into one of the wooden chairs that Grandma had been refinishing during his first trip to their farm. His eyes drifted around the kitchen. They fell upon a black and white scrap of newsprint held to the refrigerator with a magnet. Jeffrey remembered that Grandma Marion stuck everything on the refrigerator. There had been grocery lists, cartoons from ag magazines, articles about upcoming church suppers, and recipes from senior citizen newsletters plastered all over the surfaces of the fridge. He walked over and began to flip through the scraps of paper. After a moment, he found a piece about his science fair project when he was 10. He'd won second place, and his father had grumbled for a week because the boy was a loser. Another clipping featured a poetry contest entry he had submitted when he was 12 or 13. Honorable mention, and more grumbling from his father. As he continued, he found dozens more clippings and announcements. It was a collection of his achievements and failures that was probably more complete than the scrapbook he'd thrown out when he went away to college. Grandma had kept everything. Jeffrey realized he'd never seen anything stuck to his parents' refrigerator except the to-do list for the housekeepers. His fingers brushed aside another scrap and found a small bit of newsprint with the headline, Howard Peterson, 74, and a small photograph of Grandpa Howard. It was a paid notice that could be written by family members and placed in the newspaper in addition to the standard obituary. Apparently Grandma Marion had decided the cold facts version wasn't enough for Grandpa Howard. Jeffrey read the notice and found out that Grandpa Howard had been married to Grandma Marion for 50 years. They had farmed the same land for almost 40 of those years, along with raising cattle, hogs, and chickens. Grandpa Howard had been active with 4-H groups and hosted several Boy Scout campouts on their land. He'd also served on the school board and as an officer in his Veterans of Foreign Wars post. Howard was also a founding member of the Old Fart Coffee Club. The group was described as a batch of retired men who spend every Tuesday morning at the Northside Cafe eating breakfast, drinking coffee, and bragging about their grandchildren. The article also listed his surviving relatives. Marion Peterson, devoted wife, resident of Winterset. Teresa Peterson Blake, only daughter, married to Jefferson Blake of New York City, New York. Jeffrey Blake, only grandson, who always provided Howard with plenty of material for bragging on Tuesday mornings. Jeffrey wiped at his eyes, realizing that tears blurred his vision. He saw 2 hazy images of Grandpa Howard's photo, and remembered the stereoscope. He had never looked at all the cards that had been stored with the device. He'd stopped looking to go to supper as a child. Then, when he returned as a teen, Jeffrey dropped his coffee cup as he raced from the kitchen. He strode down the 3rd floor hall, focused on the last door. He burst through, expecting everything to have changed. The box still rested on the floor. A collection of photo cards lay scattered beside the stereoscope. Kneeling, Jeffrey picked up the card marked Town Square. He grasped the stereoscope and with trembling hands slid the card into the wire frame. Jeffrey saw the courthouse, the band, the crowd. No Grandpa Howard. Feverishly, Jeffrey dug through the stack of cards, jamming each into the holders. He looked at the Eiffel Tower, a half-dozen World's Fairs, and a variety of local scenes, but failed to see his grandparents anywhere. Sighing, he sat back against another carton. "You're losing it, Jeff," he said to himself. "You're letting the divorce and the bankruptcy drive you nuts." Absently, he grabbed a handful of cards and let them slip through his fingers back to the floor. He repeated this for a few minutes, then randomly grabbed a card and tucked it before the viewfinders of the stereoscope. "Let's have a look at the good old days. They sure gotta be better than what I got going on here." As his eyes focused, he drew in a sharp breath. Jeffrey's parents called the Madison County Sheriff's Office when they hadn't heard from him in nearly a week. A deputy named Boyle promptly drove out to the Peterson farm to investigate. When no one responded to his knock, he let himself in through the unlocked door. "Mr. Blake?" No response. Boyle drew his pistol, kept it at his side, and cautiously made his way through the house. Occasionally he called out, "Mr. Blake?" A systematic search of the first floor yielded a suitcase containing men's clothing in the bedroom and stacks of papers in the office next door. The kitchen revealed a spilled cup with the dried remains of coffee spread along the floor. Moving back through the house, the deputy reached the stairs and headed up to the next floor. This level revealed nothing of any consequence, and Boyle continued up to the third floor. He swept through all the abandoned bedrooms, cautiously opening each door. He'd almost cleared the entire house and still saw no clue to explain Jeffrey Blake's absence. Boyle reached the door to the last room. He noticed that it was open and called, "Mr. Blake?" as he leaned his head into the doorway. A collection of cards lay scattered around the room, each card bearing a pair of identical pictures. A few cardboard cartons lay open, leaking more of the photos. Then Boyle saw Jeffrey Blake. The man sat cross-legged on the floor. His head hung forward, and his hands rested near some weird device that looked like mutant binoculars. Deputy Boyle knelt beside Blake, reached out carefully to check for pulse, and found none. Boyle stood, placed his sidearm back in its holster, and reached for his radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is 61-4.
61-4, go ahead.
I think I located Mr. Blake." Boyle and the dispatcher recited the appropriate lines back and forth, then the deputy signed off. As he turned to leave, Boyle knelt and retrieved the odd-looking device from the floor. After a momentary hesitation, he put it to his eyes. He saw a brown and white antique photograph of a circus. A crowd watched a clown on a unicycle, laughing at the cyclist's antics. In the foreground stood a gangly farmer with his arm around a woman, probably his wife. Beside them stood a younger man, their son or grandson. Boyle shrugged and placed the stereoscope back on the floor where it had come from. The deputy stepped into the hallway and began the walk down the stairs. The stereoscope at the heart of this story does exist. It was given to me by my maternal grandmother, and as far as I know, neither it nor the pile of cards that I have for it have any magical abilities. The house with the attic access through a closet door is also real, though long since demolished, and of course Winterset exists. Its casual mention here is a bit of an anomaly, because I don't usually set stories in real places, or if I do, rarely give them their proper names. Like all of the material on the Story by podcast, Ghost Pictures is available for option for production in other media. I began a screenplay for it some time back when test driving screenwriting. So if you are interested in Ghost Pictures, I'm already several steps along into adapting it. I should probably wrap this up, since it's already longer than most of the recent episodes. If you have a minute, feel free to rate, review, or share the show, and make sure to follow Storyby on Twitter and Facebook, etc. And as always, thanks again for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Storyby Podcast is a production of Fiddling Around Productions, LLC, and copyright 2018. Theme music is provided by Nalani Proctor, nalaniproctor.com, and used with permission. Other incidental music provided by Kevin MacLeod, incompetech.com. Edited by Lewayne L. White and licensed under a Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license.